The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same day the Boston boarding house proprietress, a woman whose smile was as thin as her broth, informed Rosalie Quinn she would have to forego her wages for a second consecutive month. The year was 1887. At 25, Rosalie felt the walls of her small world closing in. The letter, however, felt like a window being forced open against a stubborn frame. It was postmarked from a place she'd only seen on maps, Dry Willow, Utah Territory, and the paper smelled faintly of dust and pine. Her grandmother, her hands gnarled by a lifetime of mending, had pushed her to answer the advertisement tucked inside the church bulletin. "Go west," she had urged, her voice a reedy whisper. "Find a decent life for yourself." Boston had been their home, but it offered Rosalie little more than the prospect of becoming a spinster, perpetually mending other people's linens for a pittance. The advertisement itself was stark. A mere 2 lines penned by a Reverend Abernathy, a gruff widower, requires a caretaker for 2 small children. Rosalie traced the words with her finger. Gruff. The word was a stone in her shoe. A warning. Yet, the thought of the 2 small children tugged at a place in her heart that had been quiet for too long. A former teacher. She missed the simple logic of a child's world, the earnestness in their questions, the warmth of a small hand in hers. The boarding house was cold in every sense of the word. She packed her single trunk with a practicality that belied the tremor in her hands. 3 sensible dresses, her worn copy of Shakespeare, and the heavy wool shawl her grandmother had woven for her. The shawl was her most prized possession, a tangible piece of love and protection. It carried the scent of home, of lavender and wood smoke, a scent she feared she would never smell again. Holding the one-way train ticket in her hand felt like holding a lit match. It was a promise of change, a thing that could either illuminate a new path or burn her completely. Her grandmother hugged her tightly at the station, pressing a small leather pouch of coins into her palm. "Be brave, my girl," she said, "and be good." Rosalie promised she would be both. The train ride was a clattering, smoke-filled journey that stripped away the familiar world layer by layer. The tidy green hills of New England gave way to the sprawling, flat plains of the heartland. And then, finally, to the breathtaking and brutal emptiness of the high desert. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue, the earth a palette of ochre and rust. It was a landscape that made a person feel small, insignificant. Yet, Rosalie felt a strange sense of expansion within herself, as if the sheer scale of the land was making more room inside her for hope. From the train, she transferred to a jarring stagecoach. For days, she was rattled and bounced alongside a silent prospector and a nervous salesman. The dust was a constant presence, a fine red powder that coated her clothes, her skin, her throat. They climbed into the mountains, following switchbacks carved into the sides of colossal peaks, still heavy with late-season snow. The air grew thin and cold. Water from the thaw ran in muddy torrents down the slopes, turning the road into a treacherous ribbon of mud. In the valleys, great forests of black pine stood like silent sentinels, their scent sharp and clean in the crisp air. She saw a coyote watching them from a ridge, its head cocked, its yellow eyes unnervingly intelligent. The wildness of it all was both terrifying and thrilling. This was a world that did not care for a person's origins or pedigree. It demanded strength, and Rosalie prayed she had enough. Dry Willow was not so much a town as a suggestion of one, huddled in a valley carved between the Wasatch Range and the dark tree line. A single muddy street was flanked by a dozen or so wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon whose bat-wing doors swung with a weary sigh, a blacksmith's shop ringing with the rhythmic clang of a hammer. The air was a mixture of scents, the sweetness of pine resin, the dry spice of sagebrush, and the underlying tang of livestock. A creek, swollen and brown with melted snow, rushed past the edge of the settlement. Reverend Abernathy met her at the stagecoach stop. He was a small, bird-like man with kind eyes and a fringe of white hair. He took her trunk and led her toward the small white church at the end of the street. His relief at her arrival was palpable. He confessed, his voice lowered with a conspiratorial air, that his advertisement had been an act of, as he put it, audacious faith. Mr. Beckett Hale, the widower in question, was a good man. He insisted, but a man locked away inside his own grief, a hard man to reach. The children, Jessie and May, were in desperate need of a woman's touch. Rosalie felt a prickle of unease. So, the widower had not placed the advertisement himself. She had been summoned by a well-meaning but meddling reverend. The foundation of her new life felt suddenly less stable. She clutched the wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. The reverend offered her tea and a slice of dry cake in the church rectory while he went to fetch Mr. Hale, left alone. Rosalie looked out the window at the town. A few women in bonnets hurried along the boardwalk, their heads together, casting curious glances toward the church. She could already feel their judgment, the swift and easy categorization another woman from the East. Come west to find a husband. The thought stiffened her spine. She was here for a respectable position, to earn her keep and maintain her dignity. Nothing more. When the rectory door opened again, it was filled by a man who seemed to block out the light. Beckett Hale was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind to the texture of worn leather. He was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair and eyes so deep-set they seemed to hold permanent shadows. He did not look gruff, so much as exhausted, as if he carried a weight that had settled deep into his bones. He held his hat in his large, calloused hands and did not meet her eyes. Behind him, peeking around his leg, was a small girl with wide, solemn blue eyes and a tangle of blonde hair. This must be May. She clutched a worn corn-husk doll, and standing just inside the doorway, his arms crossed with a defiant air that did not quite hide his anxiety, was a boy of about 10. His dark hair was a mess, and a smudge of dirt marked his cheek, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. Jessie. Reverend Abernathy began a nervous introduction, but Beckett Hale cut him off, his voice a low rumble. What is this, Abernathy? He finally looked at Rosalie, and his gaze was not unkind, but it was deeply weary. I told you I did not need any help. It was the boy, Jessie, who spoke then, his voice clear and unexpectedly firm. I asked him, Uncle Beckett, I wrote the letter to the church paper. Rosalie's heart sank. She looked from the stern, unyielding man to the defiant boy, and then to the small girl who looked on the verge of tears. She had not been summoned by a widower, nor by a meddling reverend. She had been summoned by a child, a 10-year-old boy desperate enough to forge a plea for help. Beckett Hale's jaw tightened. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound fatigue. He turned his gaze on Rosalie, and for the first time she saw something beyond the weariness. It was a flicker of anger, of a man whose private world had been breached without his consent. He was a man who did not trust strangers, who did not want them in his house, in his life. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken histories and fresh conflict. You have come a long way for nothing, Miss Quinn, he said, and the words, though spoken quietly, were a dismissal as final as a locked door. My brother's children and I, we manage on our own. The mention of his brother was a key turning a lock. My brother's children. So Jessie and May were not his own. She looked at the two small, motherless faces, and the full, complicated weight of the situation settled upon her. This was not the simple arrangement she had imagined. The man before her was not just a widower. He was a guardian, bound by duty and, she suspected, by a sorrow that was not entirely his own. She thought of her one-way ticket, of the meager coins in her purse. She thought of her grandmother's words, "Be brave," the fear of being used, of being sent away into the wilderness with nothing, warred with a powerful, rising tide of compassion for the children. She saw the longing in their eyes, a hunger for the simple comforts she knew how to give. She met Beckett Hale's hard gaze with a steadiness she did not feel. The advertisement promised a position caring for 2 children. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice even. "Your nephew appears to believe that position is needed. I have traveled 2,000 miles on that promise. I am not looking for charity. I am looking for honest work." A tense silence descended. The Reverend wrung his hands. May hid her face in her uncle's trousers. Jesse watched Rosalie, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. Beckett Hale studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for something, perhaps deceit, perhaps weakness. She held his gaze, letting him see only her resolve. The journey had been hard, but it had scoured away her timidity. Here, in this wild and lonely place, she would stand her ground. She had come west to find a decent life, and she would not be turned away by a man's pride or a child's subterfuge. An opportunity had opened, not with a grand invitation, but with the quiet, desperate need of 2 children. And Rosalie Quinn had always known how to answer a child's call for help. The silence that followed Rosalie's declaration stretched thin and tight, like a wire drawn taut. Beckett Hale looked from her determined face to the hopeful eyes of his nephew, and a muscle worked in his jaw. The man was a fortress, but a child had opened the gate from within. He gave a short, sharp sigh that was more an admission of defeat than a breath. 30 days, he said, his voice low and rough, as if he were making a deal with the devil. 30 days to prove you are what you say you are. You will have a roof and board. If the children are well cared for, you will have your wages. If not, you will be on the next stagecoach east. He did not wait for her answer, turning on his heel and striding out of the rectory, the 2 children scrambling to keep up with his long legs. The Hale Ranch was a few miles outside of town, a solid log house and a sturdy barn nestled on a gently sloping hillside. It was a place built for endurance, not comfort, inside. The main room was sparse and clean, but it lacked any softness. The wooden floors were scrubbed bare. The stone fireplace was swept but cold, and the few pieces of furniture were heavy and functional. It was a house that had been without a woman's touch for a long, long time. Rosalie was given a small room off the kitchen, barely bigger than a closet. But the window looked out over the valley, and the bed had a clean, if lumpy, mattress. It was more than she'd had in Boston. Beckett maintained the distance he had established from the first moment. He moved out to the small bunkhouse near the barn, a silent, solitary figure. He rose before the sun, the smell of his coffee the only sign he had been in the house, and he returned long after dusk. Eating the supper Rosalie left for him on the stove in silence before retreating again. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. "Fix that loose board on the porch. The well pump is sticking." He was not unkind, but he was a wall of quiet grief and suspicion. Rosalie, in turn, focused her energy on the children and the house. She learned quickly that Jesse, at 10, was a small man in the making, serious and observant, with a fierce, protective love for his little sister. May, at 6, was a shy, watchful creature who flinched at loud noises and clung to her corn-husk doll as if it were a lifeline. They were both hungry, not just for food, but for a warmth that had been absent from their lives. She began by reclaiming the kitchen. For years it had been a place for hurried, joyless meals. Now, the scent of baking bread began to fill the house, a warm, yeasty perfume that seemed to seep into the very wood. She found a patch of mint growing wild near the creek and brewed sweet tea. She taught Jesse and May how to read from the family's worn, dog-eared Bible, their small fingers tracing the grand and terrible stories. She made an abacus from a string and a handful of dried beans, and the mysteries of arithmetic began to unfold for them on the rough-hewn kitchen table. Slowly, the house began to change. Rosalie mended the tattered curtains, letting in the clean mountain light. She taught May how to braid her own tangled hair. A patient, gentle lesson that ended with May looking at her reflection in a piece of polished tin with a rare, shy smile. She found an unexpected ally in Jessie when she declared war on a particularly belligerent rooster who saw her as an intruder in his domain. The bird, a fearsome creature of iridescent black and green, would charge her every time she entered the yard, after one too many attacks on her skirts. Rosalie armed herself with a broom and stood her ground. The ensuing standoff, a flurry of feathers, squawking, and determined swings of the broom, was watched with wide-eyed fascination by the children from the porch. When the rooster finally admitted defeat and retreated with a disgruntled squawk, Jessie gave her a slow, approving nod. "You fight good," he said, the highest praise he could offer. One evening, Rosalie set 4 places at the dinner table. It was a simple act, but a significant one. Since she had arrived, they had eaten in shifts, a disconnected trio. That night, when Beckett came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the 4th plate. For a long moment, she thought he would turn and leave, but instead, he walked slowly to the table and sat down. They ate in their usual silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of 4 people sharing a space, a meal, a fragile moment of peace. The empty chair that had haunted the room for years was finally filled. A week into her trial, a trip to Dry Willow for supplies became a social ordeal. In the general store, she felt the curious eyes of the townswomen on her. Their whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves. "From the east," they said. "Come to look after the Hale children. More likely come to look after Beckett Hale." Rosalie kept her chin high, her purchases brisk and businesslike. At the town's small eatery, she met Nettie Crow, the proprietor. Nettie was a large woman with a booming voice and an insatiable curiosity, but her eyes, when they rested on Jessie and May, were surprisingly kind. She plied the children with sugar cookies while she plied Rosalie with questions, her inquiries wrapped in a thin veneer of friendly concern. "It must be hard," she clucked. "A man like that, all closed up, and those poor children. It is a blessing you came." It was there, in the eatery, that Rosalie first saw Lila Crowther. Lila was a beautiful woman, a widow dressed in tasteful, expensive black. She moved with an easy grace that spoke of a life far more refined than any Rosalie had known. She was, as Nettie eagerly informed her in a whisper, the cousin of Silas Crowther, the man who owned the bank and most of the land in the valley. Lila entered the eatery, and her eyes immediately found Beckett, who had come into town to speak with the blacksmith. She ignored Rosalie completely, her smile reserved only for him. "Hello, Beckett," she said, her voice like honey. "It has been too long." Rosalie watched as a faint flush rose on Beckett's neck. He was polite but distant, his answers to Lila's questions short and non-committal. But Rosalie saw the way the town watched them, the way they nodded knowingly. Lila Crowther was the expected match for Beckett Hale. Rosalie Quinn was merely the hired help, a temporary fixture from the east. The tension of her uncertain position sometimes sparked between her and Beckett. One night, May woke from a nightmare, her small cries echoing through the quiet house. Rosalie went to her, stroking her hair and singing a soft lullaby until the child drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Beckett confronted her. "She needs discipline, not coddling," he said, his voice tight. "This country is hard. It will break anyone who is soft. They need to know they are loved." "Mr. Hale," Rosalie countered, her own voice sharp with conviction. "That is what gives them the strength to be hard when they must. A person cannot draw water from a dry well." His face hardened, but he said nothing more. The debate, however, hung in the air between them. A fundamental disagreement about the nature of raising a child. A chasm between his world of harsh survival and her world of quiet care. Nature itself seemed to test her resolve. A late spring storm rolled in from the mountains with sudden, violent fury. The rain fell in solid sheets, and the creek that was usually a pleasant murmur swelled into a raging, muddy torrent. Beckett was out on the range, checking on a newborn calf. The creek rose with alarming speed, and with a great tearing sound, a section of fence protecting the lower pasture was washed away. Water began to pour through the gap, threatening to flood the entire field. Without a second thought, Rosalie grabbed a handful of empty grain sacks. "Jessie," she called, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We need to stop it." He did not question her. Together, in the driving rain, they shoveled mud and gravel into the sacks, their hands raw, their clothes soaked through. They dragged the heavy, sodden bags to the breach in the fence, piling them one on top of the other. A small, desperate dam against the rising water. They worked until they were both trembling with exhaustion and cold. But the wall held. The flood was diverted. When Beckett returned at dusk, leading a weary horse, he found them on the porch, wrapped in blankets, shivering but triumphant. He looked from their muddy faces to the makeshift dam, and then back again. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her competence, of her grit. It was more praise than she had ever hoped to receive from him. That night, a sense of fragile peace settled over the house. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and smelling of wet earth. While tidying the main room, putting a few of Beckett's scattered account books back onto a shelf, Rosalie's hand brushed against a small, locked drawer in the bottom of his writing desk. She had never noticed it before. Tucked behind a tin of ink was a small, ornate brass key. Her curiosity, a thing she usually kept firmly in check, got the better of her. With a glance toward the quiet bunkhouse, she fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside the drawer, there was a single, neatly tied bundle of papers. She carefully lifted them out. They were legal documents, filled with the precise, looping script of a clerk. As she read, a chill went through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. They were water rights, the deed to the very creek that flowed through the Hale property, the lifeblood of the ranch. But the name at the top of the deed was not Beckett Hale. It was Ethan Hale, his brother's name. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She knew enough about this arid land to know that water was more valuable than gold, and these papers, tucked away in a locked drawer, smelled of secrets and trouble. She gently placed the bundle back, turned the key, and slid it back into its hiding place. The quiet house on the hillside no longer felt quite so safe. Family, she was learning, was not just a matter of daily kindnesses. It was also a fortress built on a foundation of secrets she was only just beginning to uncover. The discovery of the locked drawer and its contents settled a quiet unease over Rosalie. The fragile domesticity she had nurtured in the house on the hillside suddenly felt precarious, as if built on a fault line she had only just perceived. She told no one what she had found, but the knowledge of Ethan Hale's water rights lay like a smooth, heavy stone in her mind. She continued her days as before, teaching the children, mending their clothes, filling the house with the scent of baked goods. Yet she found herself watching Beckett more closely, trying to read the silent history in the lines around his eyes. The dry season began to assert its authority over the valley. The vibrant green of spring faded to a dusty olive, and the creek, once a boisterous torrent, shrank to a more sedate, clear ribbon of water. It was on a hot, windless afternoon in late June that a rider appeared on the track leading to the ranch. It was not a neighbor or the circuit preacher. This man rode a fine bay mare and wore a tailored woolen vest despite the heat. As he drew closer, Rosalie recognized the polished, confident air of Silas Crowther. Beckett met him on the porch, his stance wide and uninviting. The children, sensing the tension, fell silent and retreated to stand near Rosalie in the doorway. Silas dismounted with a practiced ease, his smile a flash of white in his tanned face. A hot one. "Beckett," he said, his voice smooth as polished river stone, Just making my rounds, checking on my neighbors." His gaze flickered past Beckett to Rosalie and the children. A quick, appraising glance that took in everything and revealed nothing. He was a handsome man, but his eyes were cold, like a winter sky. "I brought you something to cut the dust," he said, pulling a flask from his saddlebag. He poured a measure of amber liquid into a tin cup from his kit, then added a splash of water from his canteen. The best whiskey, tempered with the sweetest spring water. Beckett took the cup but did not drink. He waited. "I have been thinking about you, Beckett," Silas continued, leaning against a porch post as if they were old friends. "Thinking about your future. This is hard country. A man alone, with 2 little ones to raise. It is a heavy burden." He paused, letting the words hang in the still air. "I am in a position to offer some security, a partnership, you might say." "What do you want?" Crowther Beckett's voice was flat. Silas smiled again. A predator's smile. "Your water, that little creek, is the key to this whole valley. My operations are expanding. I need it. I am prepared to make you a very generous offer for the rights. And of course, the bank would be happy to extend you a line of credit against your herd. A safety net for the lean years." Rosalie watched Beckett's hand tighten around the tin cup. "The rights are not for sale," he said. Silas's smile did not falter, but a hardness entered his eyes. "Do not be sentimental. Beckett, your brother is gone. A piece of paper in a drawer will not bring him back. This is business. Progress. You cannot stand in the way of progress." "Ethan knew the value of this water," Beckett said, his voice dangerously low. "And I know the value of your security. The answer is no." He raised the cup, not to his lips, but to his eye level, studying the contents. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he poured the whiskey and water onto the dusty ground at Silas's feet. It hissed for a moment, then was gone. The mask of civility dropped from Silas Crowther's face. "You are a fool. Hail," he spat. "A stubborn fool. Living in the past. You will regret this." He swung himself back onto his horse, wheeled the animal around with a vicious tug on the reins, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle in his wake. The consequences of that refusal were not long in coming. They began not with a direct confrontation, but with whispers. 2 days later, when Rosalie took the children to town, the atmosphere was different. Mrs. Abernathy, who usually greeted her with a warm smile, gave her only a curt nod. In the general store, 2 women stopped their conversation and turned their backs as she approached the counter. A chill followed her down the dusty street. The source of the poison became clear when she saw Nettie Crow. The eatery owner looked uncomfortable, avoiding Rosalie's eyes. Finally, under Rosalie's direct, questioning gaze, Nettie relented. "People are talking," she mumbled, polishing an already clean glass. "Silas Crowther was in here yesterday. Said he knew all about you. Said you came from one of those boarding houses in Boston, the kind where a woman's wages are not always for housekeeping." The ugly implication struck Rosalie like a physical blow. Her past, a simple, dreary life of unpaid labor, had been twisted into something shameful. Silas was not just attacking Beckett's finances, he was attacking his home, trying to drive her out by destroying her reputation. She felt a hot surge of anger, followed by a cold wave of fear. In a town like Dry Willow, a woman's good name was everything. She walked back to the ranch with her head held high, the children trailing behind her, confused by the sudden coldness of the town. But inside, she was trembling. That night, she debated her choices. She could leave. She could take the next stagecoach and disappear before the rumors consumed her. It would be the safe thing to do, but the thought of leaving Jesse and May to the mercy of this silent, grieving man and the predatory world outside their small ranch was unbearable. Loyalty, she was discovering, was not a decision but a root that had quietly, firmly taken hold in this rocky soil. A few days later, Deputy Tom Avery rode out to the ranch. He was a young man, barely older than Rosalie, with an honest face and a slightly apologetic manner, as if he was perpetually sorry for the trouble in the world. He brought a notice about a town meeting, but it was clear that was just an excuse. "Heard some talk in town. Miss Quinn," he said, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "It is not right. Silas Crowther has a long reach. Just be careful." He looked at Beckett, who was watching from the barn door. "He is a good man," he said, nodding toward Beckett. "He has had more than his share of hardship." The deputy's visit was a small kindness in a world that had suddenly grown hostile, and Rosalie was grateful for it. The next time Silas Crowther approached her, it was with a different tactic. He found her alone near the creek, where she had taken the children to escape the afternoon heat. He was all charm and fatherly concern. "Miss Quinn," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I have heard the unpleasant talk. It is a shame that a woman of your quality should be subjected to such slander." He let that sink in. This is no place for a lady. A lonely ranch, a sullen man, a position with no future. Rosalie said nothing, her hand resting protectively on May's shoulder. "My young niece, Eleanor, is in need of a tutor," Silas went on. "A woman of refinement and education to teach her letters and sums. The position would come with a handsome salary and a room in my cousin Lila's home. It would be a respectable, secure position, a safe harbor from all this unpleasantness." The offer was a gilded cage. It promised safety, respectability, an escape from the whispers and the cold stares. It was everything she had once thought she wanted. For a dizzying moment, she was tempted. The path of least resistance was a siren's call, but then she looked at Jessie's face, tight with worry, and at May, who was clutching her hand. She thought of the quiet trust they had placed in her. She thought of the shared silence at the dinner table, a silence that was slowly, painstakingly, being filled with a sense of family. "That is very generous of you, Mr. Crowther," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "But my place is here." Silas's eyes narrowed. He was not used to being refused. "Think carefully. Miss Quinn, loyalty to a losing cause is a fool's virtue." As she watched him ride away, an idea began to form in her mind. A seed of defiance. He saw her as gentle, as a pawn to be moved around a board. He had underestimated her, and in that underestimation lay an opportunity. A week later, she sent a message into town with Deputy Avery. It was addressed to Silas Crowther. In it, she wrote that she had reconsidered his generous offer. While she could not abandon her duties to the Hale children, she would be willing to provide a few trial lessons for his niece to see if they were a good fit. She suggested they meet at his office in the bank, where it would be quiet and conducive to learning. Silas agreed immediately, no doubt seeing it as the first sign of her capitulation. The following afternoon, Rosalie walked into the Dry Willow Bank, her copy of Shakespeare tucked under her arm. Silas's niece, Eleanor, was a pale, quiet girl of 8, overwhelmed by her powerful uncle. Silas settled them at a small table in the corner of his office, then turned his attention back to the large, leather-bound ledger on his desk, making it clear that he was a busy and important man. Rosalie began the lesson, her voice calm and patient. They practiced the alphabet, then simple words. All the while, she was acutely aware of the ledger, left open just a few feet away. As Silas became engrossed in a conversation with a rancher, Rosalie guided Eleanor toward the desk. "Now, Eleanor," she said brightly, "a real business lesson. Let us practice writing names and numbers. Look at these important accounts in your uncle's book." She pointed to a page, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the name of a neighboring rancher, a man she knew was struggling. Beside his name were columns of figures, loan amounts, and payment dates. She noticed that the date of his last payment had been subtly altered, making it appear that he was delinquent. "Copy this name for me," she instructed the girl. "And these numbers, very carefully now." as Eleanor painstakingly formed the letters and figures on a piece of slate. Rosalie took a fresh sheet of paper from her own satchel. "Oh, you have made a little mistake here. Dear," she said gently, leaning over the girl's work. "Let me show you the correct way." On her own paper, under the guise of creating a perfect example for her pupil to copy. Rosalie quickly and accurately transcribed the damning information from the ledger. The rancher's name, the original loan, the fraudulent payment date. She did it twice more with 2 other accounts before Silas finished his conversation. She folded the paper and tucked it neatly within the pages of her Shakespeare. The lesson concluded soon after. She was polite and deferential as she left, promising to send word about her final decision. She walked out of the bank and into the hot afternoon sun, her hand pressed against the book. It felt as if it were burning through the leather cover. She was afraid, more afraid than she had ever been in her life. But she was not powerless. She was a teacher, a caretaker, a woman from the East, and she had just armed herself with the truth. The sheet of paper tucked inside her book of Shakespeare was a secret heat against Rosalie's heart. In the days that followed her visit to the bank, she felt like a spy in her own life. Her calm exterior a careful mask for the nervous energy that thrummed beneath. The knowledge she possessed was dangerous, a spark that could either illuminate a path to justice or ignite a fire that would consume them all. She said nothing to Beckett, unsure how to breach the wall of his solitude with a truth so volatile. The summer wore on, hot and breathless. Then, in a turn so unnatural it felt like a biblical portent, the weather shifted. The searing blue sky of August turned a bruised, metallic gray. A wind rose from the north, carrying not the familiar scent of dust and pine, but a biting, unseasonable chill that spoke of high mountain ice. The cattle grew restless in the pastures, their lowing edged with anxiety. By late afternoon, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, picturesque flakes of a Boston winter, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising gale. Within an hour, the world was a maelstrom of white. The familiar contours of the valley disappeared, swallowed by the storm. It was a blizzard, a freak act of nature's violence that had come to lay siege to the land. Beckett strode into the house, shaking snow from his hat, his face grim. "The new calves," he said, his voice tight with worry. "They were born just last week. Their mothers will have pushed them into the sheltered coulees on the east slope, but they will not survive a night like this. They are too young, too weak." He began pulling on a heavy oilskin coat, his movement swift and economical. "I have to bring them in." "You cannot go alone," Rosalie said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a question. "This is not work for a woman. Miss Quinn, stay here. Keep the fire high." She was already wrapping her grandmother's thick wool shawl over her head and shoulders, pulling on a pair of Beckett's old gloves. 2 sets of eyes are better than one. Mr. Hail. And the wind will not care if I am a woman or a man. She grabbed a small tin bell from a hook by the stove, its cheerful jingle a frail sound against the rising howl of the wind. Their mothers will follow the sound. He looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something annoyance, respect, perhaps both in his shadowed eyes. He gave a sharp nod. "There is only one horse saddled that can handle this. You will ride with me." The world outside the house was a chaos of wind and blinding snow. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the breath and numbed the skin. Beckett swung into the saddle, then reached down, his large, rough hand closing around her arm, and pulled her up to sit behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist to keep from being thrown, pressing her face against the rough fabric of his coat to shield herself from the wind. His body was a solid, warm wall against the fury of the storm. They moved slowly, the horse picking its way through the deepening drifts with practiced care. The landscape was a disorienting, featureless expanse of white. Every landmark was gone. Rosalie began to ring the bell, its small, clear tone cutting through the roar of the wind, a tiny beacon of sound in the vast, howling emptiness. "It feels as if Boston has followed me west," she shouted over the wind, her words snatched away almost before they were spoken. "Boston does not have teeth," he shouted back, and she felt the rumble of his voice through his back. After what felt like an eternity, they found them. A small cluster of cows stood with their backs to the wind, forming a living wall around a half-dozen shivering, miserable calves, and circling them, their dark shapes just visible through the swirling snow, were the wolves. There were 3 of them. Gray phantoms moving with a patient, deadly grace. Their yellow eyes glowed with a feral light. Beckett pulled a rifle from the scabbard on his saddle. He did not fire. The sound would panic the cattle. He simply held it, its dark metal a clear threat. The lead wolf stopped, its head low, a growl vibrating in its chest. For a long, tense moment, man and beast faced each other across the white expanse, 2 predators locked in a battle of wills. Then, with a flick of its tail, the wolf turned and melted back into the storm, its companions following. Getting the calves back was a slow, brutal process. Rosalie dismounted, her legs stiff with cold, and helped Beckett guide the stumbling, frightened animals, their pathetic bleats barely audible. They shared the oilskin coat, huddling beneath it for warmth as they pushed through the snow, the horse trailing behind them. The small space beneath the coat was an island of shared warmth and grim determination. The house, when they finally saw its single, wavering light through the blizzard, was the most beautiful sight Rosalie had ever seen. They stumbled inside, collapsing with exhaustion, the calves crowding into the relative warmth of the attached mudroom, but their relief was short-lived. Jesse met them at the door, his face pale and streaked with tears. "It is May," he choked out. "She is sick! She is burning up!" They found her in her small bed, thrashing beneath the blankets, her skin flushed and dry, her breathing shallow. Her eyes were glassy with fever. A wave of fear, colder than any winter wind, washed over Rosalie. The fire in the hearth had died down to sullen embers, and the wood in the box by the stove was damp from a leak in the roof. "Get it lit," Beckett said, his voice raw with a fear he could not hide. But the damp wood only smoked and hissed, refusing to catch. Rosalie took control. Her own fear was a hard knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. She remembered the remedies her grandmother had used, the old-world wisdom passed down through generations. "Jessie," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "In the woodpile outside the door, there are willow branches. Bring me a handful of the thinnest ones. Scrape the bark from them. And bring me 2 large potatoes from the root cellar." While Jessie scrambled to obey, she found a clean cloth and bathed May's forehead with cool water from the basin. When Jessie returned, she set a small pot of water over the smoking embers and added the willow bark shavings. Beckett watched her, his face a mask of helpless anxiety, as she grated the raw potatoes into a mush. She wrapped the cold, wet pulp in another cloth and laid it gently on May's chest. "It is a poultice," she explained, her voice low. "It will help draw out the fever. The willow bark tea will do the rest." For hours, they kept vigil in the dim, smoky room. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and ice. Inside, the only sounds were May's ragged breathing and the soft crackle of the fire, which Beckett had finally coaxed into a steady, warming blaze. Rosalie changed the poultices, coaxed spoonfuls of the bitter tea between May's lips, and hummed the same lullabies she had sung to chase away nightmares. Sometime after midnight, the fever broke. The flush receded from May's skin, and her breathing deepened, becoming the slow, even rhythm of peaceful sleep. A profound, bone-deep relief settled over the small room. The fire was burning brightly now, a cheerful, dancing heart in the dark house. It was a symbol of their small victory, a defiant pocket of warmth and life against the cold and the dark. Rosalie and Beckett sat in 2 chairs before the hearth, wrapped in dry blankets, sipping the last of the willow bark tea. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion or distance, but of shared experience, of a battle fought and won together. He started to speak, his voice low and rough, as if the words were being pulled from a place of deep hurt. "My brother, Ethan," he said, staring into the flames. "He was the one who loved this place. He saw a future here. I just saw the work. He was the one who filed on the water rights. He said it was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that would last." Rosalie listened, her hands wrapped around her warm mug. "It was not a fair fight," Beckett continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The day he died. Silas wanted that water then, same as he does now. He sent a few of his hired men to persuade Ethan to sell. They started shoving him. He was never a brawler. He stumbled, and he fell. His head hit a rock, just like that. They said it was an accident, but it was not. It was murder, as sure as if they had used a gun. I was in the high country, branding strays. I was not here." He fell silent, the guilt of that absence a chasm he had been living in for years. Rosalie did not offer empty platitudes of comfort. She simply sat with him in his grief, her quiet presence a testament to the fact that he was no longer alone in that house. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. The only sound was the gentle hiss and pop of the fire. After a long time, Beckett stood up. He walked to the small writing desk in the corner and came back with the small brass key. He stood before her and held it out. He did not drop it into her hand, but waited until she looked up and met his eyes. He then pressed the key firmly into her palm, his calloused fingers closing hers around it. "You keep this for me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I trust you." The weight of the small key was immense. It was the key to the drawer, to the water rights, to his brother's legacy. But it was more than that. It was the key to the fortress he had built around his heart. In the quiet, firelit room, with the blizzard dying outside, the wall between them had finally, irrevocably, come down. The thaw that followed the unseasonable blizzard was as swift and dramatic as the storm itself. The snow vanished in a matter of days, leaving the valley floor awash in mud and the air thick with the scent of damp earth and new life. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, a new kind of peace settled over the house on the hillside. The shared crisis had burned away the last vestiges of formality between Rosalie and Beckett. He no longer called her Miss Quinn, and she, in turn, found herself calling him Beckett, the name feeling natural and right on her tongue. He remained a man of few words, but his silence was different now, companionable rather than guarded. He took his meals at the table with them every night, and sometimes Rosalie would look up to find him watching her, a quiet, contemplative expression in his eyes that she could not quite decipher. The brass key he had given her lay in the small wooden box where she kept her needles and thread. She had not used it. She did not need to. The trust it symbolized was more important than the papers it protected. A few weeks later, Reverend Abernathy announced the annual Sunday church fair, a day of games, food, and socializing that served as a vital thread in the fabric of their isolated community. For the first time, the 4 of them prepared to go not as a man with his wards and his housekeeper, but as something that looked and felt remarkably like a family. Rosalie had baked 2 dozen of her butter biscuits for the baking competition, their golden tops glistening, and May, dressed in her best frock, chattered with an excitement that Rosalie had never seen in her before. The fair was a kaleidoscope of color and sound. The church grounds were filled with families from all over the valley. The air smelled of roasting meat, sweet cider, and trampled grass. Children shrieked with laughter as they chased a greased pig, while men gathered in knots to discuss cattle prices and the weather. The women, in their crisp Sunday dresses, managed the food tables, their conversations a low, steady hum. As Rosalie was setting out her biscuits on the competition table, Deputy Tom Avery approached, his hat in his hands. "That was a fine thing you did for the Miller family." "Miss Quinn," he said, his face earnest, teaching their boy his letters. "They told me you refused any payment." "A child's mind is not something to be bartered for, Deputy," she replied with a small smile. He was a kind man, and his simple decency was a refreshing breeze in the often harsh social climate of Dry Willow. They spoke for a few minutes about the weather and the prospects for the harvest, an easy, pleasant conversation. Across the yard, Beckett watched them, his back propped against the trunk of a large cottonwood tree. He was whittling a small piece of wood, but his hands were still, his eyes fixed on Rosalie and the young deputy. He felt a low, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. It was an ugly, possessive feeling, and he did not like it. He had no claim on her. She was a free woman, his employee. But the thought of her smiling at another man, of her gentle attention being directed elsewhere, was like a stone in his gut. Just then, Lila Crowther appeared at Rosalie's side, her smile as bright and brittle as a shard of glass. "My dear Miss Quinn," she said, her voice carrying so that several nearby women turned to listen. "How lovely to see you out enjoying yourself." She placed a proprietary hand on Rosalie's arm. Her gaze flickered to Deputy Avery, a silent dismissal, and he, with a polite tip of his hat, moved away. As she spoke, Lila made a small, seemingly accidental gesture, a flick of her wrist. A fine linen handkerchief with an ornate C monogrammed in the corner fell to the ground, landing directly on the toe of Rosalie's shoe. "Oh, my heavens!" Lila exclaimed, her voice a pitch of theatrical surprise. She pointed a gloved finger at the handkerchief. "Why, that looks just like my cousin Silas's. How on earth did that get here?" A hush fell over the nearby group. The implication was as clear as it was venomous. A woman did not come to possess a man's personal handkerchief by accident. The whispers that had hounded Rosalie upon her arrival were given new life. Rosalie felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she met Lila's triumphant gaze with a cool, steady calm. She bent down and picked up the handkerchief, not with distaste, but with a thoughtful air. She examined the fine linen and the elaborate stitching. "You are quite right, Mrs. Crowther," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "It is a very fine piece of needlework, and you are wise to be concerned. A man of Mr. Crowther's position must take care not to be so careless with his personal effects. People might get the wrong impression." She folded it neatly and held it out to Lila. "I am sure you will see that it is returned to him promptly." For a moment, Lila was speechless. Rosalie had not been flustered, had not denied anything. She had simply turned the tables, making Lila the custodian of her cousin's reputation and the architect of her own failed scheme. A few of the women, including Nettie Crow, who had been watching with a sharp eye, exchanged small, appreciative smiles. Lila snatched the handkerchief from Rosalie's hand, her face a mask of fury, and stalked away without another word. The tension was broken by Reverend Abernathy climbing onto a small platform, calling for everyone's attention. "It is time to announce the winner of our annual baking competition," he boomed. After much deliberation, and I must say, much personal sacrifice on the part of the judges, we have a clear winner. For the lightest, flakiest, most buttery biscuits this side of the Wasatch, the blue ribbon goes to Miss Rosalie Quinn. A smattering of applause broke out, led by the enthusiastic clapping of Jessie and May. Rosalie, her heart still beating fast from her confrontation with Lila, felt a genuine smile spread across her face. Jessie ran up and threw his arms around her waist in a fierce hug. "You won, Rosie! You won!" As she accepted the small, hand-stitched ribbon shaped like a laurel wreath, Beckett moved from his place under the tree. He came to stand beside her, placing a hand on Jessie's shoulder and another on May's. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, the curious, the friendly, and the skeptical. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "For those of you who are still wondering," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, "Miss Rosalie Quinn is here as the governess and legal guardian for my brother's children, Jesse and May." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She has my complete trust and the gratitude of this family. Anyone who questions her honor questions mine." It was a declaration, a line drawn in the dust of the churchyard. He was a man respected for his integrity, if not for his sociability. His public endorsement was a shield, and Rosalie felt its protection settle around her. The whispers died. The tide of public opinion, a fickle and powerful thing, had turned. Later that afternoon, as the fair began to wind down and shadows grew long across the valley, Rosalie went in search of May, who had wandered off to see the newborn lambs in a nearby pen. Her path took her behind the blacksmith's shed, where the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and iron. From the other side of the wall, she heard two men's voices, low and rough. She recognized them as hired hands she had seen in Silas Crowther's company. "It is a fool's work, hauling rock in this heat," one of them grumbled. "And for what?" "For Crowther's future," the other voice replied with a cynical laugh. "Just keep your mouth shut about it. Nobody is supposed to know about that dam up on the North Fork until it is finished." "Why all the secrecy?" the first man asked. "Use your head. He waits for the real dry spell to hit in a month or two. By then, the dam will be full, and the creek below will be nothing but a trickle. He will have every drop of water in this valley under his thumb. He will squeeze these little ranchers dry and buy their land for pennies on the dollar." Rosalie froze, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a plan of breathtaking cruelty and cunning. It was not just about the Hale Ranch anymore. Silas intended to hold the entire valley hostage, to choke the life from it for his own profit. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found May with the lambs, her small face a picture of pure delight. Rosalie took her hand, her mind racing. The victory she had felt earlier, the simple honor of a blue ribbon and the warmth of Beckett's public trust, now seemed small and fragile. She had won a battle of whispers and innuendo in the town square, but she had just overheard the strategy for a war for the very survival of this valley. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was a war they were in danger of losing before it had even begun. The overheard conversation about the secret dam lay like a coiled snake in Rosalie's mind. The fragile peace she had so carefully cultivated felt like a sham, a sunlit meadow on the edge of a cliff. She wrestled with the knowledge, unsure of how or when to tell Beckett. To speak of it would be to invite a war they were ill-equipped to fight. To remain silent felt like a betrayal not only to him, but to the entire valley. The dilemma was pushed from her thoughts by the arrival of the mail rider, a lanky youth who passed through the territory once every few weeks. He brought a letter from Boston, seeing the familiar, spidery handwriting of her grandmother's neighbor on the envelope. Rosalie felt a pang of homesickness so sharp it was like a physical pain. She retreated to the quiet of her small room to read it, the sounds of Jesse and May playing in the yard fading into a distant murmur. The news was not good. Her grandmother, the woman who had been the bedrock of her life, had taken a turn for the worse. Her heart, the letter explained, was growing tired. The doctor offered little hope. She was comfortable, but weak. Rosalie read the lines over and over, the carefully chosen words blurring through a sudden film of tears. The 2,000 miles that separated her from that small, familiar room in Boston had never felt so vast, so insurmountable. She was here, building a new life, while the cornerstone of her old one was crumbling away. That evening, after the children were asleep, she sat on the bottom step of the porch, her grandmother's wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The summer night was alive with the thrumming of crickets and the distant, lonely call of a whippoorwill. A sliver of moon hung in a sky so dense with stars it looked like spilled diamonds. But the beauty of the night offered no comfort. A profound sense of loss washed over her, for the grandmother she might never see again, for the life she had left behind. She bowed her head, and the silent tears she had been holding back all evening finally came. She did not hear Beckett approach. He simply settled on the step beside her, his presence a quiet, solid weight in the darkness. He did not speak for a long time, just sat with her, letting her cry. The gesture was more comforting than any words could have been. Finally, when her sobs had subsided into shuddering breaths, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "A letter from home." She could only nod, unable to trust her voice. He looked up at the star-dusted sky. "I know what it is to feel that distance," he said softly. "To know that something is wrong, and to be helpless to do anything but watch the sun rise and set." When he spoke of his brother, Rosalie understood that he was not just offering sympathy. He was sharing the geography of his own grief. She found her voice, though it was thick with unshed tears. "It is my grandmother. She is very ill." He was silent for another moment. Then he reached out, not to touch her, but to point toward the heavens, where a great misty river of light flowed across the dark expanse. The Milky Way. Ethan used to say that was a road for souls, he murmured. He said you could look up there and know that you were never truly disconnected from the ones you had lost. They sat in companionable silence. Two small figures dwarfed by the immense, star-filled night. The shared vulnerability, the acknowledgement of past and present sorrows, created an intimacy deeper than any they had known. Rosalie felt the hard knot of her loneliness begin to dissolve in the quiet dark. Beckett turned to look at her, his face half hidden in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "You were sent west to care for a stranger's children, Rosalie," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You came here looking for a position, for honest work, but you ended up finding a man who wants to treasure you like gold, if you will let him." The words hung in the still night air, as stunning and unexpected as a meteor streaking across the sky. Rosalie's heart gave a great, painful lurch. She was breathless, her mind a whirl of confusion and a hope so fierce it was terrifying. This was not something she had ever allowed herself to imagine. "Beckett, she began, her voice a whisper. "I do not know what to say. This was their home, Sarah's home. The children. I could never take another woman's place." The fear that had been a shadow in the back of her mind was suddenly given voice. Was she just a replacement? A convenient solution to his domestic problems? He shook his head, and in the faint moonlight, she saw the profound earnestness in his eyes. "I will honor the memory of my brother and his wife until the day I die," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "They built this place. But this is not about them. This is about you, about the light you have brought back into this house, about the way you have made my brother's children laugh again. I am not asking you to fill Sarah's shoes. I am asking you to let me walk beside yours." He did not press her, did not demand an answer. He simply held out his hand, hesitantly. She placed her own in his calloused fingers closed around hers, his grip warm and sure. He gently tugged her closer, and she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. It felt like coming home. They sat that way for a long time, watching the stars wheel across the sky. Then, he tilted her chin up with his free hand and leaned in. His kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of a deep, gentle reverence. It was a promise, a question, and an answer all in one. It was late in coming, but it was as solid and sure as the mountains that ringed the valley. The next morning, the world seemed new. The sunlight slanting through the kitchen window was brighter. The coffee smelled richer. A quiet understanding had settled between them. As Rosalie served breakfast, she was acutely aware of Beckett's eyes on her, a soft, protective warmth in his gaze that made her feel both flustered and cherished. The children, with their uncanny sensitivity to the emotional currents of the house, knew that something had shifted. Jesse watched them with a shrewd, calculating look. "Is Uncle Beckett paying you in candy now?" he asked, his tone dead serious. Rosalie laughed, a real, unburdened laugh. Beckett just grunted, a faint blush rising on his neck, and ruffled the boy's hair. It was May who provided the final, heart-melting confirmation. She came to Rosalie with a small, lumpy ring she had woven from strands of Rosalie's own hair, collected from her hairbrush. "For you," she said, her voice a shy whisper. Rosalie slipped the fragile ring onto her little finger, her heart swelling with a love so powerful it almost hurt. As she was clearing the breakfast dishes, she looked out the window and saw it. Strung clumsily between the two posts of the front porch was a string of paper flags, cut from an old catalog and tied together with twine. On them, painted in wobbly letters with berry juice, were the words, "Mama Rosie." The children had been busy. It was their own proposal, their own acceptance. Her fear of being a replacement vanished, washed away by the innocent, powerful love of two children who had chosen her as their own. Family, she realized, was not something you were born into. It was something you built, piece by piece, with your own hands. Just as she was calling Beckett to come and see, a sound broke the morning's peace, the frantic, desperate drumming of horses' hooves. A rider was coming toward the ranch, not at a canter, but at a full, reckless gallop. It was their neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a man whose altered ledger records were transcribed on the paper hidden in her room. He pulled his lathered horse to a halt in a spray of dirt, his face pale with panic. "They have started! Hail!" he yelled, his voice ragged. "I rode up the North Fork at dawn. There is a whole crew of men up there. They are building the dam. The creek. It is already running lower than it was yesterday." Beckett was at his side in an instant, his hand on the sweating horse's neck. "How long?" Henderson shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "A week. The foreman was bragging about it. In a week, that dam will be finished, and this creek will be nothing but a dry bed of rocks." The simple, profound promise made on the porch steps under a canopy of stars. The fragile paper banner proclaiming a new mother. The quiet joy of a family finally finding its shape. It all seemed to evaporate in the harsh morning light. The anchor of their new life had just been set. But the storm Silas Crowther had been brewing was about to break over them with a force that threatened to tear them all apart. The calm that had settled over the ranch was shattered by Henderson's frantic arrival. The words, "They have started," echoed in the morning air, a death knell for the fragile peace they had just begun to build. In that instant, the quiet, contemplative man Rosalie had come to know was gone, replaced by a man of swift, decisive action. A hard light entered Beckett's eyes, the look of a leader who had been pushed too far. He did not waste a moment. He gave Henderson a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of the coming fight, and turned to Rosalie. "Keep the children inside. Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." His voice was low, taut with a controlled fury. He strode to the barn, his long legs eating up the ground, and emerged minutes later on his powerful buckskin horse, his rifle resting in the saddle scabbard. He did not ride toward the North Fork. He rode south, toward the small homesteads that dotted the valley floor. The fight for water was not his alone, and he knew they stood no chance unless they stood together. Rosalie watched him go, a solitary figure against the vast landscape, his silhouette shrinking until it was just a speck of dust on the horizon. By midday, he returned. He was not alone. Behind him rode Henderson, the Miller brothers, Old Man Fitzwilliam, and a half-dozen other small ranchers. They were not an army. They were farmers and cattlemen, their faces grim, their hands calloused from plows and ropes. Not weapons. They carried axes and heavy pry bars, tools of construction they now intended for destruction. They gathered in the yard, a small, determined band, their horses stamping nervously. Rosalie, I am leaving Jesse here, Beckett said, his voice grim. He is old enough to use the shotgun by the door. If anyone but us comes to this house, he knows what to do. Rosalie looked at Jesse, who stood on the porch, his young face pale but set with a terrible adult resolve. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Beckett leaned down from his saddle. He did not touch her, but his eyes held hers for a long, charged moment. It was a silent promise. I will come back. The men rode out, a grim procession under the hot sun, heading for the high country and the illegal dam that threatened to bleed their valley dry. The hours that followed were the longest of Rosalie's life. She tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for May's sake, but the air was thick with a palpable dread. The sun beat down, and the creek, their lifeblood, seemed to shrink before her very eyes, its cheerful gurgle diminishing to a listless murmur. It was May's favorite calf, a small, doe-eyed creature she had named Buttercup, that set the catastrophe in motion. Spooked by the unnatural stillness of the day, the calf suddenly bolted, kicking up its heels and running toward the low hills that separated their ranch from the North Fork. May, with the single-minded panic of a child, shrieked her pet's name and ran after it, her small legs pumping furiously. Rosalie yelled for her to stop, but her voice was lost in the vast, empty landscape. Jesse grabbed the shotgun, but he was frozen, torn between his duty to protect the house and his need to protect his sister. Rosalie did not hesitate. She ran to the barn, her skirts flying, and threw a saddle on the gentlest mare. She did not have time for fear. As she galloped after the small, fleeing figure of the child, a plume of dark smoke began to rise from the direction of the North Fork. It was not the thin, lazy smoke of a campfire. It was a thick, angry column of black that billowed into the pristine blue sky. Up at the dam site, the ranchers had arrived to find a scene of frantic activity. 24 of Silas Crowther's men were hauling rock and timber, their faces hard and unwelcoming. Silas himself was there, observing from horseback like a general overseeing a battlefield. "This is illegal! Crowther!" Beckett yelled, his voice echoing in the narrow canyon. "You have no right." "I have the only right that matters in this country. Hail," Silas sneered. "The right of the man who gets there first." As Beckett's small group advanced with their tools, Silas gave a signal to 2 of his men. They were not carrying axes. They were carrying torches. They ran to the edge of the canyon, where the dry summer grass was as thick and flammable as tinder, and threw the torches down. The fire caught with an explosive whoosh. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly seemed to shift, whipping the flames into a frenzy. A wall of fire, crackling and roaring, erupted between the ranchers and the path back to the valley. They were trapped. The smoke rolled down the hillsides, a choking, blinding wave. Rosalie rode into it, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had soaked her grandmother's shawl in the horse trough before she left, and now she wrapped the damp wool around her nose and mouth. The familiar scent of home, a small comfort in a world that had turned into a nightmare. The air grew hot, thick with the smell of burning pine and ash. Embers rained down around her like malevolent fireflies. She could barely see, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. She called May's name until her voice was a raw, hoarse cry. Then she heard it, a child's terrified sob, coming from a small ravine just ahead. She found May huddled against a rock, her face streaked with soot and tears, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Buttercup, the calf, lay nearby, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle. There was no time to think, only to act. She dismounted, wrapped the still damp shawl around the terrified child, and lifted her onto the horse. "You have to be brave. My love," she whispered, her voice a ragged breath. "I need you to sing with me. Sing the song about the little lamb, loudly so I can hear you." As she led the horse, which was wild-eyed with fear, she began to sing the simple nursery rhyme, her voice trembling but clear. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow. May, her face buried in Rosalie's back, joined in, her small, quavering voice a tiny thread of hope in the roaring chaos. The song was a beacon, a way to keep their fear at bay, a rhythm to guide their steps. Rosalie knew the creek was at the bottom of the ravine. She stumbled and slid down the steep bank, the heat of the fire a living presence on her back, and found the shallow, life-saving water. She led the horse along the rocky creek bed, the smoke thinner here, the air cooler, following the water as it snaked its way back toward the safety of the valley. When she finally emerged from the smoke, she was met by a frantic Jesse. She sent him immediately, a desperate last-ditch plan forming in her mind. "Find Deputy Avery," she commanded. "Give him this." From the pocket of her dress, she pulled the folded sheet of paper she had carried for weeks, the transcription of Silas's doctored ledgers. "Tell him everything. Tell him to meet us at the church." The fire, and the news of the confrontation at the dam, had brought the town of Dry Willow to a standstill. The church bell began to toll, not a call to worship, but an alarm. The building quickly filled with every man, woman, and child in the valley. The air was thick with fear and speculation. Silas Crowther and his men, having been forced to abandon the dam to escape the fire they had started, were there, their faces smug and defiant. Beckett and the other ranchers, soot-stained and exhausted, stood together, a small island of grim resistance. Silas took the floor first, his voice booming with false indignation. "These men," he declared, pointing a finger at Beckett, "trespassed on my legal work site. They threaten my men. They are vigilantes who have taken the law into their own hands." Just then, the church doors burst open. Deputy Tom Avery strode in, his face set and determined. He was followed by Rosalie, her dress torn, her face smudged with soot, holding May's hand tightly. "The law you're talking about, Silas, is your own," Avery said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. He held up the paper Rosalie had given him. "I have here evidence of fraud, evidence that you have been systematically cheating your neighbors, altering loan documents to steal their land." A murmur went through the crowd. Reverend Abernathy stepped forward, a heavy book in his hands. He stood beside the deputy, his small frame radiating a powerful moral authority. "And I have here the territorial statutes," he announced. "They state clearly that no man may dam a natural waterway if it deprives downstream homesteaders of their historic access. Your dam is not just immoral, Mr. Crowther. It is illegal." One by one, the ranchers Silas had cheated, emboldened by the evidence and the Reverend's words, began to speak, their voices rising in a chorus of accusation. The community, so long held in the grip of Silas's financial power, was finally finding its voice. They were choosing justice over fear. Beckett looked across the crowded room at Rosalie. He saw the strength in her tired face, the fierce, protective love with which she held his niece's hand. He saw the woman who had ridden through fire to save his family, the woman who had armed them with the truth. He understood then that he was fighting not just for his brother's legacy, but for a future he had never dared to imagine. He walked through the silent, parting crowd until he stood before her. He did not say a word. He simply took her hand in his grip firm and unwavering, and turned to face the community. It was a silent, powerful declaration, a public acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in hardship and in fire. He was letting go of the ghosts of the past and taking hold of the future. The sight of them, standing together, a united front, seemed to break something in Lila Crowther. She had been standing near her cousin, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. "Now," she stepped forward. She looked at Rosalie, and for the first time, Rosalie saw not a rival, but a woman who had made a terrible mistake. "I am sorry," Lila said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried in the silent room. "For everything, I was wrong." It was the final blow to Silas's crumbling authority. The community had redefined itself. It had chosen decency, courage, and the rule of law over the power of a single, greedy man. Deputy Avery placed a hand on Silas Crowther's arm. "You are under arrest," he said. As Silas was led away, a stunned silence fell over the church. Outside, a light rain began to fall, a gentle, cleansing drizzle on the smoldering, fire-blackened hills. The land, like the community, had been scarred, but it had also been purified. The warm ash, Rosalie knew, would enrich the soil, and in the spring, new life would grow, stronger and more resilient than before. The ranchers, led by Beckett, began to talk in low, hopeful tones, not of what they had lost, but of what they would now build together: a new, shared dam, a fair division of the water, a future for their valley. The autumn that followed the fire was a season of healing, for the land and for its people. The rain that had quenched the flames also coaxed new life from the blackened soil, a tender green fuzz that promised a full recovery under Beckett's quiet leadership. The ranchers of Dry Willow worked side by side. Their old suspicions burned away with the dry grass. They built a new dam on the North Fork, not a monument to one man's greed, but a low, sturdy structure of rock and timber that would ensure a fair share of water for everyone. The sound of hammers and saws echoed in the canyon, a rhythm of cooperation and hope. Silas Crowther had been taken away to face territorial justice, and a sense of clean, quiet order began to settle over the valley. The wedding was held on a bright, crisp afternoon in October, when the cottonwood trees along the creek had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. There was no ceremony in the church, no formal reception. They were married in the backyard of the house on the hillside, the place where their family had been forged. Reverend Abernathy presided, his kind face beaming. Rosalie wore a simple dress of soft muslin, the color of fresh cream. She had sewn it herself, its only adornment a line of delicate stitching at the collar and cuffs. Beckett stood beside her, not in a new suit, but in the familiar worn brown coat he wore when he rode the range, brushed clean and pressed for the occasion. He looked at her not as a possession to be claimed, but as a miracle he had been given, his eyes full of a quiet, profound awe. They did not exchange rings of gold. Instead, May, her face scrubbed clean and her hair neatly braided, stepped forward and solemnly placed a crown of wild daisies she had woven onto Rosalie's hair. Then Jesse, standing tall and trying his best to look serious, presented Rosalie with a small, lopsided circle of wood he had carved himself. Burned into it with a hot nail were the words, "Barn Manager." It was his official transfer of authority, his highest honor. Rosalie accepted it with a gravity that matched his own, pinning it to her dress like a precious jewel. After the simple vows were spoken, they did not have a receiving line, but a long trestle table set up under the open sky, laden with roasted chicken, fresh bread, and apple pies. Their neighbors, the Hendersons, the Millers, Old Man Fitzwilliam, and all the others, came not as guests, but as friends, bringing dishes to share. Nettie Crow arrived with a ham so large it took 2 men to carry it, and even Lila, her face softer and her smile genuine, brought a delicate lemon cake. The long table, filled with the people who had once judged Rosalie and now embraced her, was a testament to the community they had rebuilt together. In the midst of the quiet celebration, the mail rider made a special trip out to the ranch. He brought 2 letters. The first was for Tom Avery, who had come to pay his respects. He opened it with a puzzled look, which quickly turned to one of stunned disbelief. "Well, I will be," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "They have made me the new sheriff." A cheer went up from the ranchers, a round of applause for the young man who had found his courage when it mattered most. Dry Willow was entering a new era of law and order. The second letter was for Rosalie. It was from Boston. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The news was a quiet miracle. Her grandmother, with the stubborn resilience that had defined her life, had rallied. The summer had been hard. The letter from her neighbor read, but the crisis had passed. The doctor was amazed. She was weak, but she was mending. Tucked inside the letter was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Rosalie's breath caught in her throat as she unwrapped it. It was her grandmother's wool shawl, the one she had left behind. It still smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. A small, pinned note read, "Every bride needs a dowry. This is all I have to give. Welcome home." Tears welled in Rosalie's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so complete it was almost painful. She walked into the kitchen, the heart of her new home, and draped the shawl over the back of the simple wooden chair at the head of the table. It was a bridge between two worlds, the weaving together of the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Her roots and her new home. Finally, in the same place. Later, as the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long, peaceful shadows across the yard, Beckett came to stand behind her as she looked out at their guests. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. "Are you happy, Rosalie?" he asked, his voice a low murmur against her hair. She leaned back into his embrace, a feeling of profound peace settling deep into her bones. She was no longer a substitute, no longer a caretaker filling a void. She was a wife, a mother, a woman who had found her place not by chance, but by choice, by courage, and by love. She was home. "I am," she whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." Jesse, who had been listening with the unabashed eavesdropping of a 10-year-old boy, cleared his throat importantly. "I reckon my fee as best man should be calculated by the head of cattle," he announced to the sky. "Thank you for being with us through this story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.